Welcome to the PA Books Podcast. PA Books is a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. This program features interviews with authors of books on Pennsylvania people, history, sports, business, nature, and politics. We hope you enjoy this podcast. This week on PA Books, Robert Wynstra, author of No Place for Glory.
Robert Wynstra is the author of No Place for Glory, Major General Robert E. Rhodes and the Confederate Defeat at Gettysburg. How did you become interested in Robert Rhodes?
Well, my first book was about Alfred Iverson, who was one of his brigade commanders. And I plumbed his career in depth. And as I went through, I ran across a ton of information, some of it which hasn't been used before, regarding the entire brigade or the entire division, and sparked my interest in bringing in all of that. And as I was looking for a new avenue for my third book, I thought I could look in depth at the entire division rather than just Iverson's brigade.
Well, let's talk a little bit about Rhodes. Where did he grow up?
Rhodes is a native of Lynchburg, Virginia. He attended Virginia Military Institute, graduated in 1848, which of course, right there in Lynchburg's area, so natural to go there. And then after that, he became a civil engineer in the railroad industry, and he was in Missouri, Texas, and ended up in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So he was a Virginian in Alabama when the war broke out. And he had just been appointed to be a teacher at VMI, which he had been trying to do for several years. And when the war broke out, instead of taking that position, he formed a volunteer company in Tuscaloosa, Alabama.
How did he get a commission?
Basically, he helped form a volunteer company, and at the camp of instruction, they held elections for the field officers, and he was voted to be the colonel based on his background as a VMI graduate.
So as the war is beginning, what kind of a combat officer was he?
He was a strict disciplinarian, very strict disciplinarian, and an advocate of constant drilling. So his troops were some of the finest drilled troops in the Army. And they made it to Virginia in time to briefly take part in First Manassas. And while he was at that area, right after the battle, he was in a brigade commanded by Richard Ewell, who later became his corps commander in Lee's army. And Ewell became one of his biggest advocates and helped push him along and got him appointed as a brigadier general in the fall of 1861.
So the period just prior to which you cover in your book includes the Battle of Chancellorsville. And at that point, if we kind of just look at him before the starting point of the Gettysburg campaign, what was he doing and what kind of an officer was he?
He was a highly regarded officer, but like I say, he was a strict disciplinarian and an advocate of constant drilling. Some of the men joked that they'd rather suffer through some of the worst weather in the winter rather than have him make them out there marching every day for 5 hours. They'd rather be stuck inside in a snowstorm than be under his thing. But the men liked him. He was an affable guy. He was generally well liked by everyone, and he was a top-notch commander. He performed well in the 7 Days campaign at Gaines's Mill, and he performed brilliantly at Sharpsburg and South Mountain in the Maryland campaign, Antietam, as the Northerners call it. So he was a top-notch officer, and when Daniel Harvey Hill transferred out of the Army, he was in Daniel Harvey Hill's division, and when Daniel Harvey Hill transferred out of the Army in January of 1863, Rhodes became the temporary commander. But surprisingly, Stonewall Jackson, who was his corps commander, preferred to have Edward Johnson be the new division commander. But Johnson was absent, wounded, and he remained a temporary commander until Chancellorsville of the division.
So how did he perform at Chancellorsville as an officer?
He became, after Jackson, probably one of the biggest heroes of Chancellorsville. He was at the forefront, of course, of the flank attack on the 11th Corps in the woods there. And as one of his contemporaries wrote to a fellow officer, after Jackson, he seems to be the biggest hero of the battle. So for the Southerners, he proved to be a real hero of that battle, and basically got what amounted to a battlefield commission to be Major General.
So after the Battle of Chancellorsville, in which the Confederate forces defeated the Union troops there, why did Lee decide then to try to make a push into Pennsylvania?
A lot of it had to do with the problems. Well, after Chancellorsville, they ended up in what amounted to a return to the previous position, which is a stalemate along the Rappahannock River, which many of the men reacted to their victory at Chancellorsville with actually more with despair than joy. I mean, this is viewed as by many people as Lee's greatest victory. Many of them viewed with the victory with despair because they were too weak to follow up and really decisively destroy Hooker's army. And Lee did not want to be stuck with a stalemate. He wanted to take the initiative. And also they began to suffer severely from shortage of supplies because of problems in gaining. The Shenandoah Valley had virtually been decimated of crops, and they were having a lot of supply problems. So there were several issues. One was to be able to push north, gather supplies, and also to put political pressure on the North. He hoped that a victory in the North would cause the Northern populace to realize that the war was unwinnable and be so worn out that they'd finally sue for peace.
Now, you mentioned in the book that Robert Rhodes had a penchant for having every detail in place before aggressively moving forward with an attack. Are these personality characteristics play a role in his performance?
They certainly do. They certainly seem to on the second day, particularly on the second day at Gettysburg, when he was assigned to assist Jubal Early's night attack on Cemetery Hill, which surprisingly resulted in the capture of a number of batteries at the top of Cemetery Hill and seemed on the verge of actually turning the Union Army's flank. But Rhodes was so careful in his preparations, and his operation ran so late that by the time Early's troops penetrated the top of Cemetery Hill, his men were not in position. It ended up being a night attack that he actually had to cancel before it actually moved forward, and he received a lot of blame for that amongst the other commanders in the Confederate Army.
Let's go back and just kind of look at the people who were involved in Rhodes' division and corps.
Yes.
So his corps commander would be Lieutenant General Richard Ewell. Who was he?
Richard Ewell was a U.S. Army veteran. He had been a captain, fought in the Mexican War, was a captain in the pre-war Army, and he was a Virginian and had been one of Jackson's most trusted subordinates. He suffered a major wound in the Second Manassas campaign, resulted in the amputation of his leg. He was out of action until just before the Gettysburg campaign got underway, when he was appointed to be Stonewall Jackson's successor as the Second Corps commander.
Now, there are two figures who play a role in the Gettysburg campaign that we'll probably be talking about. One is Alfred Iverson. Who was he?
Alfred Iverson. He was the son of a Georgia senator, U.S. senator. He was served as a officer at a very young age in the Mexican War in a Georgia volunteer battalion. Through his father's influence, he was appointed from the civilian ranks as a officer in the 2nd U.S. Cavalry prior to the war in the middle 1850s. And it was posted at Carlisle Barracks and some other major posts, fought against some Comanche Indians in the period just prior to the war. And of course, his father was a strong secessionist and was one of the real firebrands in the South. And he, of course, then left the U.S. Army and joined the Confederate cause.
Now, another figure that we'll talk about is Edward O'Neill.
Edward O'Neill was a lawyer in Alabama. He commanded an Alabama brigade at Gettysburg. He was a lawyer and an ardent secessionist. And he got a lot of influence as a secessionist leader in Alabama. He commanded the 26th Alabama, which was part of what had been Robert Rhodes' brigade. So he was one of the commanders of one of the regiments in Robert Rhodes' brigade, which also included Rhodes' 5th Alabama Regiment. He had mixed success and was really regarded by many as merely a political general with no real military experience. And a lot of people were skeptical about his abilities, including Rhodes. As the campaign got underway, they were trying to find a replacement for Rhodes. Lee unexpectedly picked him to be Rhodes' replacement and put forth his nomination to be a brigadier general. Rhodes protested so vigorously against this that Lee withdrew the nomination right before the campaign got underway, and so everyone could see how well he performed in the Gettysburg campaign. So his future was pending as the battle got underway, and he regarded Rhodes as one of his bitter enemies because Rhodes had been the one who had prompted Lee to withdraw his nomination as the new brigade commander and promotion to brigadier general.
So as the Confederate troops are moving forward, at what point do they cross over the Pennsylvania border?
June 22nd, they crossed over the Pennsylvania border and moved briefly on to Greencastle and then north through the Cumberland Valley, through Chambersburg, Shippensburg, and Carlisle, up toward Harrisburg.
Now, in the book, you talk, as they move into Maryland and into Pennsylvania, you talk about how the Confederate troops are seizing African Americans, those who are enslaved in Maryland, as well as free African Americans in both states.
Yes.
How extensive was this, and what were they doing with these people once they were seizing them?
It's very extensive. It really is much more expensive than people realize. Now, particularly in Chambersburg, on June 15th, Albert Jenkins, who was a brigade cavalry commander assigned to Rhodes' division, carried out a raid on Chambersburg on June 15th. He caught everybody pretty much off guard, and his men hauled off about 60 African Americans from Chambersburg and took them south. They were then taken back. Supposedly, they would be returned to their former owners if they were runaway slaves, or if they couldn't find their owners, and some of them were free blacks, so obviously they didn't find their owners, they would actually be sold back into slavery.
Now, the route that they were taking into Pennsylvania kind of follows the route of today's Interstate 81, Greencastle to Chambersburg, Shippensburg, eventually to Carlisle. And
right.
How were they greeted by the people who lived in these communities?
They were greeted with a certain amount of fear and dread. But Lee had put through this General Orders number 72, in which he governed how they would be treated by his men. And he put in strict rules that were generally followed, but particularly Albert Jenkins' men were not beyond violating those rules. But really, there were very, very few examples of outright violence, but they gathered up huge amounts of supplies. And worst of all, they paid the money, the owners of the property, with Confederate money or Confederate script, basically IOUs, which were basically worthless. So although it was done officially, and officially they got compensation, the reality was that the farmers were wiped out by this, and they hit every farm they could go to. They hauled away tons of horses, cattle, sheep, farm equipment, you name it, they took it.
Now, were they planning to go to Harrisburg?
The big objective was to go to Harrisburg because Lee and the other commanders felt that would carry huge symbolic value. It would be the first major capital in a northern state to be taken in the war, and they felt that would be a huge psychological blow to the North. So yes, the main aim was to go to Harrisburg and seize the state capital there.
Now you talk about how when the troops were at Carlisle that there was a bout of extensive drinking. What was going on?
Well, they were enjoying themselves. I mean, some of them were sleeping indoors at Carlisle Barracks. There was a big army base there, Carlisle Barracks. Some of the men were sleeping indoors for the first time. They were getting all the food they wanted. They were eating turkeys and hams and beef cattle, and they enjoyed themselves. And drinking was just part of the lifestyle at that time, and they enjoyed themselves. They got drunk. One of the biggest issues was that some of the top officers also participated in drinking, including Rhodes, who got notoriously drunk during a flag raising ceremony at the barracks in front of the commandant's quarters. And many of his staff officers were so drunk that they were actually falling down, and people had to grab their coattails to keep them from toppling over during the ceremony.
Now we talked about them wanting to go to Harrisburg, but they didn't make that trip. When did they get orders to head down towards the Gettysburg area?
Let me see. Albert Jenkins probed the area around Harrisburg, and as they were probing that area, Lee received news from a scout came through Longstreet from a scout that the Union Army was moving north much quicker than they expected. And he decided he had to concentrate his forces around Chambersburg. Initially, it was going to be around Chambersburg to counter that move by Hooker. So on June 29th, two of Ewell's divisions were up around Carlisle and heading toward Harrisburg. Edward Johnson's division headed south on June 29th back toward Chambersburg. Rhodes' division was held until until the following day, when new orders came in ordering them to concentrate around either Gettysburg or Cashtown. And so they took a different route and headed south and ended up a few miles outside of Gettysburg on the night of June 30th, about at the town of Heidlersburg, just outside of Gettysburg on the night of June 30th, Rhodes' division.
Now you mentioned that the Union troops were moving up faster than they expected. As these Confederate troops were moving into Pennsylvania, where was the Union Army at that point?
It was in the southern part of Pennsylvania by that point, moving, more, but they were very spread out. So only certain parts of the Union Army were moving up close to Gettysburg. And so on the first day, of course, on both sides, you only have parts of each army engaged in the battle there.
So when on the day that they arrived in the Gettysburg area, what were their orders? Well,
they were supposed to be heading to Cashtown. When they got north, about at at the town of Middletown, which was known as Middletown at the time, Biglerville area, 7 miles north of Gettysburg, Rhodes' division in particular heard gunfire, cannon fire coming from the south. So they were headed to Cashtown because Ewell, who was traveling with the Rhodes division, decided to go to Cashtown. As they got to that area, they heard the cannon fire and they turned south on the road leading to Gettysburg. They made a change in plans. Johnson's division, meanwhile, was trekking on the other side of South Mountain, south toward Chambersburg, and then east toward Cashtown.
Now, you mentioned that after arriving north of Gettysburg, Ewell held a strategy session with Rhodes and Early. What did they talk about?
Basically, where they were going to head the next day and what their orders would be. Ewell, in particular, was frustrated by the lack of clarity in the orders that he got because Lee sent him an order that basically amounted to, well, if practical or if possible, you can go to either Cashtown or Gettysburg. And Isaac Trimble, who had been a major general who was kind of unassigned but attached himself to Ewell's corps, was there, and he claimed later on, although some people are skeptical about some of his stories, that he argued vehemently that they should head to Gettysburg rather than Cashtown. But Ewell was frustrated with him and decided he was going to Cashtown until the next morning, then they arrived north of Gettysburg and heard the cannon fire.
Now, during the battle, you often hear a lot of stories of skirmishers, and you say in the book that Rhodes established formal skirmish detachments in his division at the beginning of 1863. What were skirmishers? What was their role in the unit?
He was a real innovator. Before his move to form those units, everything had been done kind of on an ad hoc basis. They would gather up men on the front lines, send them forward. They would basically go forward to make sure that no one was going to trap them, go forward and a thin line to kind of clear the area in front of the advancing troops and make sure that they wouldn't be caught by surprise. He formed formal units that actually trained for that duty and did it throughout the whole division. Basically, by the time of Gettysburg, he had formed units that consisted of 1/6 of the men in each brigade formed into these skirmisher units. Sometimes they're called sharpshooters, which is a little bit of a misnomer because basically they operated mostly as skirmishers. They did have long-range rifles and had some training as sharpshooters, but they mostly served as skirmishers.
Now, the Battle of Gettysburg would begin on July 1st, and Rhodes' unit would be heavily involved in some of that fighting. Were they expected to get involved in a major battle there?
When they arrived there, they had no idea. They thought the Union Army was not that close, and they did not expect to be pulled into a battle right away. It came as somewhat of a surprise to them.
Can you describe as Rhodes' division was moving down into the northern part of the town, just outside of the town, can you kind of describe where his division was in relationship to the Union troops?
As they pulled into town, the fighting had already begun on the other side of town along the Chambersburg Turnpike, coming in from Cashtown between the Federal First Corps, and you have the famous, wounding of Reynolds with elements of A.P. Hill's Third Corps, which had been camped at Cashtown. So the fighting was going on sort of northwest of town along Chambersburg Turnpike. And Buford had put forward, General Buford, who was famous for his encounter with Hill's troops along Chambersburg Turnpike, had put what they called vedettes, cavalry skirmishers, along the road that Rhodes' troops took into Gettysburg from the north. And he encountered these skirmishers there, and he threw out his own skirmishers, and soon they became involved in a several-hour struggle to clear the roadway into the north of Gettysburg. As they moved in, Ewell spotted a hill nearby, Oak Hill, which is known as Oak Hill, which is where the famous Peace Light Memorial is today, if you go there on the battlefield. And he moved the bulk of his troops onto Oak Hill while they skirmished with some of Buford's cavalrymen. The bulk of the troops moved into place on Oak Hill, overlooking the Forney farm field, the McLean barn. These are some of the famous spots on the first day of the battlefield in that part of the town.
So as Rhodes' division is coming down into that area, what was his plan for his brigade commanders?
When they got there, he and Ewell worked out a plan. They decided they would send Iverson's brigade and O'Neill's brigade would launch an attack against a group of federal troops from the Federal First Corps, and part of the 11th Corps, which had just moved into the area, along with what became known as Oak Ridge, which is just basically the northern extension of Seminary Ridge along the area around Oak Hill. So they moved into place, and that would be followed up by an attack by Junius Daniels' brigade in the area of what became known as the Railroad Cut, famous Railroad Cut. And those troops would stay on the north to watch for any late arriving troops from the Federal 11th Corps and kind of watch over the situation. So you had Rhodes' two worst commanders, Iverson and O'Neill, leading the way in the attack, which is many people found to be something they could hardly believe that he did, but that's what he did.
And you mentioned in the book that even historians have looked back on this and wondered why he chose his weakest commanders to lead the way. Any insight into that?
I think, and it seems to be, it was pure chance. What happened is that they had this kind of rule that as they were marching north, the brigades would rotate who was at the head of the column each day. So just by chance, Iverson's and O'Neill's brigades were at the head of the column as they were heading toward Gettysburg. The best division or brigade commander, Dot's and Ramser's men, were actually in the rear, which is something they almost never were. And so they ended up being in reserve on Oak Hill and didn't become engaged, while two of his worst commanders led the way. It's kind of, but really it seems to be that it came about by pure chance.
Well, let's talk about how his worst commanders did on that day. O'Neill's forces would be the first to move down and make contact with the federal troops. What happened?
They barely made a dent. They came down. They were pushed back almost immediately in their first attempt. Rhodes didn't trust O'Neill that well. He personally tried to interfere, I guess, with the deployment of the men. He was there, tried to firsthand tell him exactly where to go. Instead, they didn't follow his directions, and they kind of stumbled forward, and O'Neill was pushed back almost immediately. Now, he would return later on, but his initial attack was pushed back almost immediately.
Now, Iverson's forces would end up crossing over a field on their way towards the Union lines. What was their experience like as they were crossing this field?
They went forward like if dress. They talk about them moving forward as if they were on dress parade. They marched forward without any skirmishers at all along their front lines. The way the situation worked out, the skirmishers did not move into place. Now that was partly Rhodes didn't order them forward, and Iverson said he didn't have time to push them forward. So they moved forward across this open field toward some skirmishers that they saw in the field that they thought were threatening to attack some of the Confederate batteries on Oak Hill. And they moved forward, but behind the stone wall was hidden 6 Union regiments, primed and ready and waiting for them to come. And as they moved within about 80 yards of the wall, they sprang up at once and fired off a tremendous volley that just tore Iverson's brigade to shreds.
What did his men do when they were hit that hard?
Basically, they ducked for cover into a slight gully that went across the field there. You can go there today and see the actual field. That part of the battlefield is really well preserved. You can see it. It's incredible to see. And they fell by the hundreds. I mean, literally by the hundreds, in heaps, right there. And they couldn't retreat. They couldn't go forward. They'd get slaughtered. They couldn't retreat. They'd get slaughtered. They just sat there and took enemy fire. And by then they were getting crossfire from an area of woods on their left from Cutler's brigade that had moved into place there, and part of Baxter's brigade, which kind of flexed forward on their right. And they were getting crossfired, stuck in a hollow, and slaughtered almost to a man.
So where was Iverson while this was all going on? Was he leading his troops from the front?
He was not leading them from the front. He stayed behind. A lot of people said he was hiding behind a log as his men moved forward to get slaughtered. By then his brigade had become almost dysfunctional because of all the disputes that he was having with his men over his favoritism for promotion for some of his friends, for his kind of incompetence. He was hated in the brigade, and so it was just a totally dysfunctional affair that was going on as they moved forward that day across the field.
So how did Rhodes respond to O'Neill and Iverson's troubles at this point?
Well, he attempted to send, first of all, he got O'Neill to try to come to their aid. By then, the Confederates were trapped in the hollow, and some of the Union troops were coming out of the field to take them as prisoners. And they gathered up right there on the spot, nearly 350 men from Iverson's brigade who were slightly wounded, and then there were hundreds of other men that were either badly wounded or dying. But he sent O'Neill forward again to try and rescue them and that failed again. And so you had he tried to throw in a couple more of O'Neill's regiments into the battle. They got pushed back, so O'Neill failed again. So again, his two worst commanders fell apart on the spot.
Now, you talk in the book about how the Union troops were capturing battle flags from these units. How important are battle flags to soldiers at this time?
Very important. It was a sign of their honor, and they'd do anything possible not to lose the flags. And they actually captured two of Iverson's battle flags and one of O'Neill's there on the spot, which is for the Confederates, it was very, very uncommon to lose battle flags in any other major battles, most of which, of course, for Lee's army were victories. And they felt it was a sign of dishonor and shame to lose the flags.
How was Rhodes communicating with his subordinate officers during the battle?
He was on Oak Hill, looking down over the battlefield, and was trying to communicate through his staff officers, of course, and he was having a mixed luck. No matter what he did, Iverson and O'Neill seemed to not do so well. At the same time, Junius Daniels was going down toward the railroad cut, which is another famous area there, and was having a lot more success in pushing back the Union troops that are around the McPherson railroad cut and around the McPherson farm, just south of Oak Hill. And Dole's troops were holding out in the north and waiting for any signs that any more of the Federal 11th Corps was coming into position. So it was a mess.
And one of the officers you talk about is Captain Don Peters Halsey. Who is he?
Don Peters Halsey is a Lynchburg native. He was one of the most brilliant men in Lee's army. He had graduated at the age of like 18 from the University of Virginia. He then studied in Europe at major universities all over Germany. He spoke like 5 or 6 different languages fluently. He came back, although he was a Union supporter. He came back as a Union supporter. He came back to try and keep the state from leaving the Union. But when the war broke out, just like Lee and some other sort of pro-Union Virginians decided to go with the Confederate cause, basically to go with their native state of Virginia. He also was like a incredibly brave officer. He became a staff officer under Iverson's predecessor, Samuel Garland. And when Iverson took over the brigade from Garland, he kept Halsey on as his assistant adjutant general. And so Halsey was kind of, unlike Iverson, Halsey was well liked in the brigade and seemed to be an incredibly competent officer.
What was his role during the battle?
He basically went out when the men were stuck out on the Forney Field and getting slaughtered. There was one group from the 12th North Carolina under Lieutenant Colonel Davis who kind of escaped from the worst of the slaughter. He went out to try and help them out. And although he had no orders from Iverson, he decided he wouldn't stay behind the lines. He went out there and tried to rally the troops who were stuck on the field and the men that were and trying to organize them in some shape to eventually move forward and try and renew the attack.
Now, after these initial setbacks, the Confederates would eventually push the Union troops back. How were the tables turned?
Well, a lot of it had to do with Dotson Ramseur. Stephen Dotson Ramseur, everybody called him Dotson or Dodd, was probably the best brigade commander in Lee's entire army. He was a incredibly brilliant and gallant commander, but he had been held in reserve throughout most of the fighting. So just as things looked like they were really totally falling apart for Rhodes' division, I mean, it looked like it was just a day of disaster, Ramseur came in and personally led his troops. Unlike Iverson, he personally led at the very forefront his troops in a brilliant attack across the Forney Field and drove the Union forces off of Oak Ridge in a brilliant way, and suffered only minor casualties while capturing several hundred Union prisoners.
Now, towards the end of July 1st, that first day of the battle, Rhodes' division would end up in Gettysburg. And at that point, how did he assess the day's events?
He initially wanted Ewell to move forward. He initially halted his brigade or his division in Gettysburg because they were tired, and because Lee had sent out orders earlier that he did not want a general battle brought on until all his other troops were in place. As Ewell struggled with whether or not to resume the attack and take Cemetery Hill, where many of the Union troops were retreating, Rhodes initially favored moving forward, but only if they got reinforcements on their right flank. And when that fell through, he ended up kind of changing his mind and ended up not supporting an attack on Cemetery Hill, which later on became what nearly everybody criticized Ewell for doing.
Now, this decision by Ewell not to proceed and attack the Union troops on Cemetery Hill, that would become, you mentioned how it would become later part of the Lost Cause movement. What was the Lost Cause, and how was this particular part of the battle used by them?
Well, the Lost Cause, it had a lot of aspects to it that basically the Confederates did not lose because of their lack of fighting spirit, skill, bravery, but were overwhelmed by the wealth and size of the North. One aspect of it that became emphasized by many people was kind of the invincibility of Lee, his untarnished reputation as a commander, and to do that, you had to find out some way to explain what happened at Gettysburg, the defeat. And so they often pointed to other people, and Ewell became one target for the criticism as to why events that day fell apart, or those 3 days fell apart.
So after the first day of the battle, and the strategic situation was different than it had been previously, what were Lee's orders to his troops on the next day?
Well, he had to decide whether they got a victory, but it was an incomplete victory. They didn't take Cemetery Hill. The Union troops were on the high ground on Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, which is nearby. And he had to decide what to do next in terms of how to move forward on the next day. And eventually, rather than moving his troops to another location to get more favorable ground, he felt like maybe all of the Union troops weren't into place yet, and that he could maybe turn their vulnerable, the Union's vulnerable left flank, and carry out an echelon attack along Cemetery Ridge and turn their flank.
So as July 2nd begins, what is Rhodes' division assigned to do?
Rhodes' division receives orders that they're not part of the main attack that's taking place with Longstreet's two new divisions and part of A.P. Hill's corps on the flank of the Union Army, on the left flank of the Union Army. Ewell's corps was ordered to carry out some operations around Cemetery Hill. Jubal Early, who was one of the other of Ewell's division commanders, launched an attack on the eastern side of Cemetery Hill, which surprisingly was very successful in carrying the heights. And Rhodes was supposed to join in the attack if there was any sort of a breakthrough. And he had actually worked out a plan with Ewell to support him in the attack that day, and moved his troops into place on the western flank of Cemetery Hill along an area called Long Lane, and was going to move forward onto the flank of the western flank of Cemetery Hill, and it would turn out to be a night attack.
And what happened?
As he moved forward, it got later and later and later. His penchant for having everything in place caused numerous delays. His troops were delayed getting into place. The advance was delayed getting underway. It was night. The men didn't like being put into position for a night attack in the darkness. They were all Many of them were very upset about it. As they moved forward, got later and later. They started to draw fire from Cemetery Hill, and they stopped after a short advance. And Dodson Ramsar, who sent out some scouts, and they did a reconnaissance of the hill, and decided that the position was so impregnable that they couldn't move forward. And Rhodes actually canceled the night attack, which sent Jubal Early and some of the other commanders into a total uproar for failing to follow through on their promise to support him in the night attack, which by then had failed completely.
Now, there was on the third day of the battle, what was Rhodes' division assigned to do?
Basically, 2 brigades from his division were detached and sent off to O'Neill's and Junius Daniels' brigades were sent off to assist Edward Johnson in a renewed attack on Culp's Hill, which was supposed to coordinate with Lee's attack that became known as Pickett's Charge on the northern end of the line at Culp's Hill. The Union launched a spoiling attack early in the morning on July 3rd, which kind of destroyed those plans completely. These other 3 brigades remained along Long Lane, and were supposed to follow up if Pickett's troops made any breakthroughs in the Union lines. And they were waiting there all day to see if they would move forward, of course, which they did not in the end.
Now, given Rhodes' performance during this battle, as well as the performance of Iverson and O'Neill, once the battle was over, what was the fallout?
Rhodes got a lot of criticism from Jubal Early and some other people, but he did not. He was in no danger of losing his position by any means. He had his problems, of course, that day, and received, like I say, a certain amount of criticism. Jubal Early reportedly said that Rhodes was fairly censurable for his misconduct in carrying out the attack on Cemetery Hill. Iverson, of course, was stripped of his command, and basically after a brief tenure as a temporary brigade commander in another one of Lee's divisions, he was shipped off to Georgia. O'Neill was also passed over to be brigadier general, and a new brigade commander was appointed, and he eventually left Lee's army in January of 1864.
How did Rhodes perform in other battles after this one? Was the Gettysburg situation an anomaly for him?
Absolutely. He performed brilliantly in the Overland campaign. I mean, absolutely brilliantly, and he repeatedly everything he did basically in that operation confirmed that for whatever reason Gettysburg had been a total aberration. He performed so well that the Army was in real shock when he was killed at the Battle of Third Winchester in early Shenandoah operations in the fall of '64.
Now, you talk extensively in the book about how the wounded were treated. What was it like to be a wounded soldier or wounded Confederate soldier at this battle?
Well, the conditions were horrendous. They set up two locations for Rhodes Field Hospital, about a mile and a half west of a mile and a half from the field where Iverson's troops were slaughtered. There were just literally hundreds of wounded soldiers there. I mean, Iverson's brigade ended up having like 800 casualties. Daniel's brigade, in sheer numbers, because it was so huge, it wasn't the worst in percentage terms, but because it was so huge, they had more than 900 casualties. O'Neill's brigade had 700 or 800 casualties. So you literally had hundreds of wounded, mangled soldiers on these two field hospitals, on these two farms. And the horror stories are just one after another, and they were short on medical supplies, on amputation equipment, taking down barn doors to use for carrying out amputation operations on many of the men, piles of amputated legs and arms lying around. Guys would be pulled in and they'd see these piles of amputated limbs. It's just horrendous.
Now, you mentioned in the book that troops were forbidden from helping wounded comrades during a fight. Why?
To maintain unit cohesion and to keep the troops moving forward on the battlefield. But it wasn't that no one was assisting the men. They had what's called the ambulance corps in each regiment. 2 men from each company were assigned as litter bearers, and they operated along with the assistant surgeon with each unit moving forward in the attack. So it was forbidden for individual soldiers to help their friends. You couldn't go forward and keep the battle moving forward, keep the troops moving forward if men were dropping out every few feet to help their friends. But they were getting treated and taken back to aid stations behind the lines and then onto the field hospitals.
After the battle was over, Lee's army had to make its way back to Virginia. What was it like for wounded soldiers to be riding in wagons on their way down to Maryland and into the Potomac River?
Well, the one I'm most familiar with, and the same things happened in other units, but I'm most familiar with what happened with Ewell's men. And they went through an area called Monterey Pass. And the wagons were loaded with soldiers who were screaming in agony. Bumpy roads. It was raining like crazy, thunder and lightning. They had herds of cattle who were being herded along the roadway. They got loose in the mountains. The thunder scared the animals. They were making all these noise, bellowing sounds, lightning, and they were getting attacked by Union cavalry. I mean, it was a horrendous situation. So you had this entire midnight battle at Monterey Pass that, basically was horrendous for anyone in that long column of wounded soldiers.
Now, there also ended up being a fight in Hagerstown, Maryland. Who was involved in that fight?
Well, basically, there were some Confederate cavalry units in Hagerstown. They were attacked by some Union cavalry who came in from the south and were driven back. And by then, Iverson's brigade had been assigned to escort the wagon train of wounded, was beginning to approach that area. And so Iverson's troops became kind of the centerpiece, along with some of Albert Jenkins' cavalrymen in routing the Union forces out of Hagerstown and preventing them from stopping Lee's retreat and overwhelming the survivors.
Now, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I just wanted to ask you about one of the things you say. You say that the Confederates stole several $1 million worth of loot from the terrified merchants and farmers in central Pennsylvania's lush Cumberland Valley. How were they transporting this vast amount of loot that they had stolen from Pennsylvanians?
Well, a lot of it was in the wagon trains. Along with the wounded soldiers in Ewell's division, there was the wagon train that Ewell had heading south was, can you believe this, 40 miles long when stretched out along the roadway, 40 miles long. It was filled with hundreds of wounded men, but it was also filled with all of this loot, plunder, is the best way to describe it, that they were sending south. In addition, herds of sheep, cattle, horses, a lot of it had been sent back earlier than that, but a large amount of it was being transported south in that long wagon train.
We've been speaking with Robert Wynstra. He is the author of No Place for Glory, Major General Robert E. Rhodes and the Confederate Defeat at Gettysburg. Thank you for speaking with me.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Enjoying this podcast? Visit PCNTV.com to find out how to support our mission. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network. You've been listening to a podcast of PA Books, a production of PCN, the Pennsylvania Cable Network. Full episodes of PA Books, as well as other PCN programs, are available to stream with the PCN app. Visit PCNTV.com or the App Store for details.